Fire and Ice hit 1983 like Conan pulled straight out of a nightmare. A frozen wasteland, a fortress of fire, barbarians and witches locked in a world on the brink. A fantasy painted by Frazetta and driven to life by Bakshi's obsession with real human motion. But behind the rotoscoped steel and the lava glow, there were battles nobody witnessed. Bakshi wanted blood. Frazetta wanted kids to watch. Warrior poses that secretly shaped every He-Man toy. And Robert Rodriguez spending decades trying to bring it all back to life. These are 10 weird facts about Fire and Ice, where flesh became fantasy and every frame fought to stay alive. Number 1. Ralph Bakshi and Frank Frazetta were two artists who lived on the edges of their industries. Bakshi built his name by fighting against the polished, polite animation studios of the day. Frazetta shaped fantasy by painting worlds full of danger, power, and raw emotion. Both men were stubborn, both were intense, and neither was used to sharing control. That's why their partnership seemed impossible. The idea started with a question Bakshi couldn't shake. He kept imagining what would happen if Frazetta's artwork wasn't trapped on a canvas. What if those figures could breathe, move, and step into a story? He brought the idea to Frazetta more than once, pushing gently but relentlessly. The painter finally said yes, not because he trusted Hollywood, but because he trusted his own instincts. When production began, their creative styles collided. They argued over poses, debated shadows, and pored over sketches for hours, sometimes without saying a word. But with every session, something shifted. The stubbornness became collaboration, the tension became energy, and beneath the noise, they found a rhythm that neither man expected. In the end, they created a world that didn't feel animated in the traditional sense. It felt physical, it felt alive. It felt like a Frazetta painting that had learned how to move. Fire and Ice wasn't just a film. It was the moment two uncompromising artists discovered they were stronger together than apart. Number 2. Before Fire and Ice ever looked like animation, it looked like a strange stage play. Actors stood on bare sound stages in simple costumes holding prop weapons. They weren't performing for the camera, they were performing for the pencil that would follow them. Bakshi filmed every scene in live action first, choosing movement over perfection. The actors ran, fought, stumbled, and pushed themselves through physical choreography that left many of them exhausted. Then, the animators stepped in. Frame by frame, they traced every gesture, every shift of weight, every ripple of muscle. The goal wasn't exaggeration, it was honesty. The process was slow, it was tedious, but the result had a kind of physical truth that no traditional animation could mimic. When characters ran through fire or swung a sword, it didn't feel animated. It felt inhabited, as if real bodies had stepped into Frazetta's world and refused to leave. Fire and Ice didn't start with drawings. It started with bodies that became art. Number 3. From the start, Ralph Bakshi and Frank Frazetta wanted two very different films. Bakshi came in swinging. He imagined Fire and Ice as a hard-edged fantasy, sharper violence, darker stakes, and a world that felt dangerous the moment you stepped into it. That was the voice he built his career on. Frazetta saw something else. He thought about young artists, teenagers discovering fantasy for the first time, kids staring at his paintings on posters and book covers. He believed the movie should reach them. For him, fantasy only lives if the next generation can walk through the door. Their debates started almost immediately. They argued over wounds, over costume cuts, even over how intense a single shot should feel. But each argument pushed the film into clearer shape. Bakshi softened the edges. Frazetta allowed a little more heat. The tone became a mix neither man had planned, bold, physical, and still accessible. In the end, Fire and Ice earned a PG rating, not because the film was tame, but because two stubborn artists found a middle ground that kept the danger alive, without shutting the young dreamers out. Number 4. Long before Fire and Ice reached theaters, two young painters walked into the studio with portfolio cases and no idea what the future held for them. Their names were Thomas Kincaid and James Gurney. At the time, they were talented newcomers looking for steady work. Inside the Bakshi Frazetta workshop, they found something better, a classroom run by one of the most influential fantasy artists alive. Frazetta didn't teach with long speeches. He taught by watching. He'd stand behind them as they painted, offering a nudge toward a deeper shadow, or pulling a color warmer until the whole world on the canvas felt alive. Kincaid and Gurney absorbed every correction, learning how to shape mountains, jungles, and ruined fortresses with the bold lighting Frazetta was famous for. When the film was released, most viewers never knew these young painters had touched every corner of its landscapes, but anyone who looked closely could feel it. The beginning of two remarkable careers taking shape behind the scenes. Fire and Ice didn't just showcase fantasy art, it helped train the artists who would go on to define it. Number 5. When the animators began shaping Tigra, they ran into a problem no pencil could fix. No actress looked the way Frank Frazetta drew. His heroines had a presence that lived somewhere between realism and myth. Every audition reminded the team how impossible that standard really was. To guide the search, Frazetta pinned two massive character sheets on the studio wall, life-size drawings of Tigra from the front and side. Each actress who stepped through the door stood in front of those outlines, and every time something felt off. After weeks of auditions and more than 50 hopefuls, the team finally landed on Cynthia Leek. She didn't match the drawings exactly, but she moved with the confidence and fluidity Tigra needed. During rotoscope, animators softened some lines and exaggerated others. They even redrew parts of her costume when she declined to wear a thong on camera. It wasn't dishonesty, it was translation. They weren't copying a body, they were chasing a feeling. And by the end, Tigra felt alive in a way only Fire and Ice could have created. Half human, half dream, shaped by an actress, an artist, and a team trying to honor both. Number 6. When fans talk about the origins of He-Man, they usually mention Conan, or the bodybuilding craze of the early 80s. But there's a missing link, a film that slid under the radar and changed the look of an entire toy aisle: Fire and Ice. Mattel's designers were obsessed with Frank Frazetta long before He-Man existed. His paintings were pinned to their walls, his poses were copied in sketchbooks, and when Fire and Ice hit screens in 1983, they suddenly had moving reference. Warriors who didn't just stand like Frazetta heroes, they moved like them. Those rotoscoped bodies, the broad shoulders, the angled stances, the grounded weight, became a blueprint. Early Masters of the Universe concept art shows the same silhouettes, the same way muscles twist when a character swings a sword. Even Skeletor echoes the film's skull-faced demons, sharing that eerie mix of elegance and menace. Mattel never stamped "inspired by Fire and Ice" on the packaging. They didn't have to. You can see it in every figure from the earliest lineup. A fantasy film built for adults quietly shaped a toy empire built for kids. Sometimes the biggest influence doesn't roar. It sneaks in like a shadow and reshapes the world without making a sound. Number 7. Fire and Ice didn't explode at the box office, but it echoed, quietly, strangely, in all the places where artists go to steal fire. The blend Bakshi and Frazetta created, half pulp adventure, half fever dream, became a secret map for the next wave of fantasy. Animators studied the way the film mixed beauty with danger. Comic artists copied its shadows. Directors borrowed the mood, the heat rising off the landscapes, the way bodies looked powerful but haunted, the sense that every frame could tip into violence or myth. You can see the fingerprints everywhere, in the heavy metal magazines of the late 80s, in the darker corners of European fantasy comics, in movies like Heavy Metal 2000 and Wizards, where the worlds feel seductive and hostile at the same time. Fire and Ice wasn't a mainstream hit, but it showed creators something important. Fantasy didn't have to be clean or safe. It could be raw. It could be sensual. It could feel like a dream you weren't sure you wanted to wake up from. That tone, dangerous, intoxicating, alive, became a blueprint, and once artists saw it, they never let it go. Number 8. When Fire and Ice opened in 1983, nobody could quite place it. Reviewers walked into the theater expecting a straightforward fantasy adventure and walked out arguing over what they had just seen. Some admired the ambition. Rotoscope movement paired with Frazetta's painterly style felt bold and strangely elegant. Others called it confused, too grown up for kids and too gentle for adults who wanted something heavier. That uncertainty followed the film into theaters. It arrived during a summer ruled by Return of the Jedi and studio blockbusters, and Fire and Ice, quiet, strange, and defiantly handmade, simply didn't stand a chance. Screens emptied, word of mouth faded. But that wasn't the end. Once the film hit VHS, something changed. Fantasy fans discovered it in small rental shops. Art students passed copies around like contraband. Young animators studied its movements frame by frame, trying to understand how drawings could feel so heavy, so physical. The film never needed a theatrical triumph. It grew underground, exactly the way cult classics usually do. Number 9. Fire and Ice pushed Ralph Bakshi harder than anything he had ever made. Rotoscope sounds simple on paper. Film the actors, trace the movement, but doing it day after day was brutal. Every frame had to match Frazetta's style. Every pose needed the weight of a painting. Every correction meant starting over. Bakshi later said it felt like climbing a hill that kept getting steeper. His crew worked until their hands cramped, then worked some more. By the end, he was proud, but exhausted in a way only animators understand. Frazetta experienced the same production from a completely different angle. Where Bakshi saw the grind, Frazetta saw the miracle. For decades, his paintings lived on posters and book covers, frozen in place. Suddenly, they were breathing, moving, fighting. He'd step into the studio, watch the footage, and smile like a man seeing his own imagination wake up. He called the finished film a living canvas, and for him, that meant everything. Two artists, one film, one pushed to the edge, one lifted higher than he ever expected. Fire and Ice was punishing to make, but it also became the moment Frank Frazetta's world finally opened its eyes and walked. Number 10. Decades after Fire and Ice found its cult following, filmmaker Robert Rodriguez walked into a meeting with one mission: bring Frazetta's world back to life. Not as animation, as flesh and blood. blood. Rodriguez had been obsessed with the film since childhood. He secured the rights in 2008, assembled a team, and started building something ambitious: a live-action remake that would use motion capture and practical effects to preserve the rotoscoped weight of the original. Early test footage showed warriors moving with the same grounded, muscular physicality that made Fire and Ice feel so different. For the first time in decades, it looked possible. Frazetta's paintings could walk again. Then everything stalled. Frank Frazetta passed away in 2010, and control of his estate shifted. New stakeholders had new concerns. Studios grew cautious. The project that had felt so close suddenly couldn't move forward. Rodriguez held onto the artwork and the test shots, waiting for the moment when the pieces might align again. That moment never came, but the attempt itself mattered. It proved Fire and Ice wasn't just a relic of the 80s. It was a world directors were still trying to resurrect, a flame someone someday might finally relight. Bonus fact: in Fire and Ice, everyone thinks they know his name: Darkwolf, the barbarian in the wolf pelt, the silent force of nature who steals every scene he walks into. But here's the strange truth: the movie never says his name, not once. On paper, he's Darkwolf. In the script, in the production notes, on the posters. But inside the film, he stays completely unnamed, speaking only through action. No introduction, no title, just a myth in motion, defined by the swing of an axe and the shadow of a pelt that marks him as something more than human. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an oversight. It was a choice that made him bigger. A hero with no name becomes a legend everyone remembers. Fire and Ice was never made for the masses. It was carved by hand, brushstrokes turned into bodies, paintings turned into motion, and two artists refusing to smooth out the rough edges that made their worlds feel alive. It wasn't clean, it wasn't safe, but it was real. This is the movie kids found by accident on a VHS shelf and never forgot. The movie artists studied like scripture. The movie fantasy fans whispered about because nothing else moved, breathed, or burned quite like it. If this world ever grabbed you, if you can still see Tigra running through molten light or Darkwolf stepping out of the smoke like a living Frazetta painting, drop a comment and tell us the moment that stayed in your blood. Because Fire and Ice never wanted to be a blockbuster. It wanted to be unforgettable. And for the fans who carried it forward, it is.